So welcome to Emotional Wellbeing for Autistic Adults. I'm Lizzie and I'm a late diagnosed autistic person. So I wasn't diagnosed until I was 42, 5 years ago. I'm also mum to two autistic boys aged 7 and 10. So my lived experience is quite interesting in that it spans living as somebody undiagnosed and struggling significantly with mental health issues, lifelong mental health issues, to becoming someone that is diagnosed and empowered, but still struggling with the invalidation that exists for a lot of autistic people because they look and sound and appear neurotypical. Therefore, they're not taken seriously. So this topic today is really personal and quite important to me because of my lifelong struggle with mental health issues, and because I've never been a passenger. I've always wanted to be in control, and it never made sense to me that my brain was so messy and awkward and causing me so many problems. For me, there had to be a reason why, and I was constantly asking, well, why? Why am I struggling with all these things? So I've kind of had this lifelong pursuit of good mental health and good emotional well-being, and that's what I want to share with you today. What we're going to cover, we're going to look at what makes autistic adults more vulnerable, because the fact of the matter is that an autistic person's experience is such that we're much more susceptible to bad stuff, whether that is negative life events or our cognitive and sensory differences. So you'll see here, we're going to look at the relationship between cognitive and sensory differences and the negative life events, and how those two sets of things kind of conspire to make our life experience much more tricky and challenging. And then what we're going to do is look at what I've changed in my life to give me better control over my emotional well-being, and therefore how you can better support autistic adults to achieve emotional well-being using my experience. We should have around 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions. So let's look at what we know. The data that I'm going to share with you here comes from Autistica. They're the leading autism research charity in the UK, and I actually sit on their insights group and contribute my experience towards their research projects. So I find them a really good source of info for kind of current thinking on autism. And Simon Baron-Cohen is a lead researcher there, and he's done a lot of good work around autism and vulnerability. So the first thing we know is that autistic adults, up to 80% of us, experience mental health issues versus 25% of the general population. So straight away you can see there, it's fact. Autistic people experience mental health issues much more frequently. Anxiety and depression are particularly common, so there's no real surprises there. And the highest incidence occurs between the ages of 12 and 25. Obviously, that adolescence going into early adulthood, puberty, that minefield that is puberty, is often triggers for mental health issues beginning. With autistic individuals, what we often see is that the mental health issues they experience aren't isolated issues. They go on to become kind of a recurring theme condition in their lives. I showed signs of OCD and anxiety as young as 4 years old. Mine, OCD still today, is all safety related. I was one of 6 children, and I was terrified that my brothers would stop breathing. So at 4 years old, I would go around to their bedrooms when they were asleep, and I'd listen to see if they were breathing, or I'd put my fingers under their nose. Obviously, it's completely weird behaviour for a small child. And I have to confess that even as an adult, when I first started drinking socially with my brothers and they got drunk, I'd say to my husband, can you just go and check their breathing? And he'd think I was completely mad. But it was this fear, this compulsion that if he didn't check and then they weren't breathing and they died, it'd be my fault. I also had really bad night terrors from a very young age. And I couldn't get to sleep unless I'd have a little ritual. I am going to have a dream. I'm not. I am. I'm not. I am. I'm not. And I'd have to keep going until the not felt right. Again, probably sounds bonkers, but to me, sleep was such a fearful place for me because of these night terrors that I tried to control it and sort of talk myself into thinking it was okay to go to sleep. So it was very, very early on in me, and I don't think I'm an unusual example of that, autistic children are very susceptible to early mental health issues. We also know, and I've definitely experienced this, is that our mental health services really struggle to see the complex dynamic between autistic neurology and actual mental health. And the approach tends to be, how can we support you with your autism, or how can we treat your mental health issues? I know lots of autistic adults who've been turned away and declined support because their struggles are seen as part and parcel of their autism. And there's almost an attitude that, well, this is part of your neurology, we can't help you with it, just kind of get on with it, which is hugely disempowering and scary. Another thing that we know, and this will make good sense to everybody here, I'm sure, is that good sleep hygiene is crucial to physical and mental health. Having those kind of healthy patterns of time to get up and time to go to bed, as well as amount of sleep, has a significant impact on overall physical and mental well-being. But autistic individuals struggle with sleep problems much more than the general population. So between 40 and 80% of autistics have sleep problems. And that's definitely been a lifelong issue for myself. The other thing that's come out in the research that Autistica have done over the last few years, and this may seem a little contentious, is that autistic people experience more negative life events. And perhaps that can sound like we're blaming autistic people, or I have to admit, I have sometimes questioned, am I really unlucky, or am I bringing stuff on myself? Because I definitely have more negative life events. But the proof is there when you look at the anecdotal evidence, talk to autistic people. And it's not that we're unlucky, or not that we're doing something wrong. Our autistic neurology makes us more susceptible to having a more extreme reaction to negative life events. We find it harder to cope, we're less resilient, we find it much harder to recover. So I am considered an autistic person with good outcomes, and I find that so patronising when people have said that to me, because it's like, oh, you've actually done a lot of the things that neurotypical people do. Wow, you've achieved some of those expectations and goals that normal people set out to do. Drives me bonkers. But yes, I have achieved a lot in my life that I am proud of, not because they're neurotypical standards, but because they're things that have made me happy. So I thrived academically at school. I had a long and successful career in HR and training, and it was only after my autism diagnosis that I sort of changed track and applied my training skills to teaching people about autism. I've travelled extensively and had lots of adventures. I've been married to my partner. I think we've been married, I'm really bad with numbers, but I think we've been married about 11 years. We've been together 18 years. So I have managed to hold successfully down a relationship, although he says that I've tried to break up with him hundreds of times. This is true in a meltdown. We have two amazing autistic children. That being a mum is the best thing that's ever happened to me, and is definitely my biggest achievement. And I own my own home. So yes, on paper, you could say, oh, this girl, this woman's doing okay. But then you have to look at my traumatic negative life events. And I'm not telling you these stuff to make you feel sorry for me, because I don't need pity. But it is my reality and my truth. And it's really, really important to understand what sits behind that mask that people see of, oh, this is how you meet the neurotypical expectations. So I grew up amongst domestic violence and alcoholism. I had a very abusive childhood, and lived in a state of perpetual fear until I left home at 16, which, you know, when you are scared every day, all of your life, then that does have significant long-term ramifications for your feeling of personal safety. And it's no wonder that my OCD is driven by safety. Although I did thrive in mainstream education because I was bright and I love learning, and to be honest, my home life was so bad that I loved school. So even though I was bullied throughout school quite mercilessly, and it was horrible, school was still a happier place for me than home. I have been married before, and I'm very fortunate, I think, in that both of my long-term relationships, and not knowing that I was autistic when I met those people, and probably coming across as a very complicated and tricky person to be around, I've had 2 really healthy, happy relationships. But my first marriage did end in divorce, initiated by myself, but that caused me such mourning and grief because I imagined we'd grow old together, and because autistic people think in pictures, just like when I lost my first son, which happened afterwards, you visualize being with that person, what you'll look like when you're old and what you do together, or you visualize the things you're going to do with that child and how they'll take their first steps on the seafront. We lived in Brighton at the time. But after my first marriage ended, I did meet my husband of now, and we decided to have a family, and we were really lucky. We fell pregnant really easily, and autistic people can be quite naive, I think, about real life. I know that maybe sounds strange, but I knew about miscarriage, but I never in a million years thought something could be wrong with my baby. And when we went to our 12-week scan and they said, it turned out through several tests, they said something was wrong, and then we had to go and see specialists in London, and they said that he had a rare lethal chromosome disorder and couldn't survive. Part of his brain was missing at the back, and that was actually catastrophic to me. And there was a real lack of understanding amongst the medical profession, amongst family, amongst friends, because my son was only 14 weeks gestation, and so everybody treated him as a fetus, not a person. And I wanted to take him home and bury him and have a proper funeral, which I did, but they were used to people just leaving the body and going. I wasn't even entitled to a death certificate. So this is when I mentioned about autistic people experiencing things much more kind of significantly, acutely. Even now, my son in heaven, Pablo, would be 11. He'll be 12 in June this year. I still feel such an intense connection with him, and I still recall so intensely the moment when I delivered him. It was like, it's all so real. My husband doesn't feel that connection at all. Like, I'm sure if I left him to it, he'd never go to the cemetery again. Not because he doesn't care, but because autistic people place so much more value and significance on rituals, and that's been a very significant thing to me. I've also been very unlucky with my health. So considering I've never smoked, I've been vegetarian since I was like 13, I think. I experienced breast cancer when I was pregnant with my youngest son, and I also have a chronic blood clotting disorder, which means I'm on lifelong blood thinners to stop me having a stroke. And that has been hugely disempowering, trying to navigate this idea that it feels like my body's determined to try and kill me, no matter what I do to try and look after myself. And that is really, really hard as an autistic person to get my head around. And I must admit, every little thing that ever goes wrong, like I had a tonsil stone and I thought I had tonsil cancer, because now once you've had cancer, then you just think it's, maybe some people can relate to this, but you're always waiting for it to come back. It's very hard to put a lid on those fears. The most significant thing that's happened to me almost 2 years ago now is that I did decide to permanently estrange from my birth family, which, whilst that was very hard, not a day goes by when I don't feel sad and miss them. God knows why I miss them, but I do. The continued invalidation of my feelings and denial of the abuse that we went through as children, and the manipulation and gaslighting I experienced as an adult, I had to make that choice for me, for my mental health and well-being. It was like, either I make this decision, or I do think I would have ended up killing myself. I know that sounds dreadful, but such was the pain that they were causing me. I had to trigger that negative life event for a better positive outcome in the long term. What's sort of a consistent theme across all of those events has been my poor mental health. In some cases, it's my poor mental health that may have triggered some of those events. In other cases, I think my poor mental health has been as a result of those events, but always there's just been this relationship of my very sensitive reactionary brain struggling to cope with and get over bad things. So why are autistic people more vulnerable? You know, what is it that means that we have more negative life events, or that up to 80% of us do have poor mental health? Well, it's two things really conspiring together. And it's not just because we're autistic. There's nothing wrong with us. We're not broken. Thank you very much. Even though the medical profession still call it a disorder, and there are very disabling aspects to being autistic, what you have is our cognitive and sensory differences, which make us more susceptible to struggling with things that happen to us. But those things alone don't create the poor mental health. There has to be the negative life events. So, for example, the autistic difference could be poor social interaction skills, meaning it makes it difficult for us to form meaningful relationships. We probably have a very small circle of trust, maybe only a handful, if not just one or two close friends that we would actually really be able to talk to. But we fall out with that trusted friend. And that is catastrophic for an autistic person, because you place so much value on those few relationships that you do have, and you know that it's going to be really, really hard for you to replace that person. And your natural low self-esteem is going to make it really, really difficult to be able to understand how to recover that situation. So that's where you end up with social isolation and depression. So the cognitive and sensory differences I'm going to briefly walk you through are not an exhaustive list, but these are the main areas that significantly impact the autistic experience. So the first one being alexithymia. This is actually a personality trait where autistic people can struggle to identify and describe their emotions. We're going to look at each of these in a little bit more detail. You've got interoception. So that's one of our body's senses. In this case, it helps us read our body's internal signals. We have executive function, cognitive skills that control our behaviour. And finally, intolerance of uncertainty. So we struggle with the ambiguous, the unknown. That's scary for us, right? That's really uncomfortable. That drives stress levels, that drives anxiety, and it's a trigger for these OCD type behaviours, these time-consuming, controlling behaviours that we utilise to try and mitigate our anxiety. So looking at alexithymia, alexithymia, it's actually believed that it affects up to half of autistic adults. So that's quite significant. And it isn't part of the diagnostic criteria at the moment. I guess because it's seen as a personality trait, it's not a diagnosable thing. But this idea that you can struggle to identify your own emotions. So you feel, you know, your body's trying to tell you stuff, or you know in your head you're feeling something, but you can't quite put your finger on it. So what my oldest son, he knows absolute giddy excitement and joy, and he knows hot rage and anger. Everything in between is shades of grey. And he'll, on his day-to-day, you know, he'll come home from school and I can see he's really overloaded. I can see he's had a tricky day. I know something's upset him. But I'll say to him, "Are you all right, mate? Like, what's going on? What happened today?" And he just can't, you know, he's very, I mean, he's academically really gifted and intellectually able, but he cannot connect. It is all those shades of grey. And it's not that he doesn't want to talk to me. He just really struggles to put his finger on it. And I have to be really careful not to put words in his mouth and to give him the space to start to work through what it is he's feeling. The other way it can affect us is our ability to understand other people's emotions. So we might not be able to understand their reactions or relate to how they're behaving in a certain situation. This does affect 10% of the general population. So it's much more prevalent in autistic people, but it does affect the general population as well. Normally people with quite severe mental health conditions like depression, trauma, psychosis. The thing about alexithymia that's so interesting is clinicians are now starting to realise, and researchers are starting to realise, that it's alexithymia that affects an autistic person's empathy. This whole like empathy issue around whether autistic people experience empathy, of course we do. In fact, with effective empathy, our ability to feel for another, many autistic people are hyper empathic, but that whole idea of cognitive empathy, being able to walk in another's shoes, sort of second guess and anticipate what they're feeling, that's tricky. And that's actually thought to not be part of autism. It's part of this. It's alexithymia. Very disempowering thing to experience. Then we have the interoception. So I don't know if any of you have seen the Disney movie Inside Out. I'm a mad Disney fan. But this film speaks to interoception, our internal sense that tells us if we're hot or if we're cold, if we're hungry or thirsty, if we feel sick or we need the loo. Really important messages. But autistic people, like with any sense, can be over or undersensitive. Now, if you're oversensitive to your interoception, chances are the autistic person's called a bit of a hypochondriac or an attention seeker. They might seem to you to just have a sniffle or a little headache, or their temperature slightly raised, and it seems like they're complaining and making a fuss. But to them, they're experiencing those symptoms in a very aggressive way. Or when they need to go to the toilet, or they feel hungry, or they need a drink, they need it now. And they can seem like they're being completely unreasonable, impatient, but it's because those signals are coming out fast and furious, and they're not being difficult. They feel like, especially, I really struggle with how children get treated in school when they're not allowed to go to the toilet, wait till the end of the lesson. If you're oversensitive to interoception, it feels like you're going to have an accident. You're like, you need to go now. And a teacher forcing you to stay in that classroom is, you know, you won't be able to concentrate, you won't get any learning done. All you're thinking about is, oh my God, I'm going to have an accident. It's torturous, really. For people that are undersensitive, it's just as tricky. So it can equally be a trigger of meltdowns if you're over or undersensitive. When you're undersensitive, all of these signals get a bit mixed up. So again, you might, like alexithymia, you might sense that your body's sensations are trying to tell you something, but you're not quite sure what they are. So these are the adults that do still have toileting accidents, even though you might consider that they're generally continent. But because they don't realise they need to go until the last minute, particularly if you're out and about and you don't know where the toilet is, this is where accidents happen. Or they might be someone that seems a bit deflated and not acting like themselves, and you just think, oh, I'll take their temperature, or you brush against them and realise they're burning hot. They're 40 degrees. And you're like, why didn't you tell me? But they don't know. Or they go out on a sunny day with 3 jumpers and a coat and a hat on, and you have to say to them, aren't you hot? You know, take some of these layers off. One of the things that can happen when you're undersensitive to interoception as well is this overeating, because we interpret the signals we're getting as hunger, and we think we sense something and we think, oh, satisfied with eating. Of course, the feelings that we're experiencing don't go away because it wasn't hunger in the first place. Your body's still trying to tell you that you're really tired and you need to rest, or you're really upset about something, or you need to get up and stretch, you need to exercise, your muscles are all restless, but you're just thinking, I'm hungry, and eating. So again, it's an area that can be improved. Mindfulness is a really good way of helping people connect to what's going on inside their body, linking and labeling. None of these things that I'm describing are fixed. So with alexithymia, using things like emotion wheels, you can start to help people understand and relate to feelings better. With interoception, engaging them in breathing exercises, mindfulness, yoga is really good. They start to tune in better to these areas of vulnerability. The executive functioning is the area that, for me, is the most disabling aspect of my autism. So in your frontal lobes, you've got these set of skills that in most people, they develop instinctively. And these are core life skills. So this planning, organising, your self-control and emotional regulation, your time management, problem solving, working memory, the steps in a process, all of this stuff enables you to study independently, secure a job and hold down a job, run a home, manage your self-care, your hygiene, your medication, eating a healthy diet. These skills are critical in all aspects of day-to-day life. and they develop instinctively in most people, but up to 80% of autistic people are really lacking in this area. We don't have that instinctive development of these skills. We can learn them, but they'll never be instinctive. So I've invested huge amounts of time in this area, because especially when I used to work in corporate HR, to do the job that I did and work under the pressure that I was under and deliver deadlines and manage all of these different multiple projects, it's no wonder that I kept having nervous breakdowns. But I learned how to use calendars, how to use reminders on my phone, how to manage to-do lists, you know, all of these different things. That I learned breathing exercises from my emotional regulation. I took advice from people on how to break down a task. So I learned about critical path, and that if this is the project that I'm managing, where's the finishing position, and then work backwards to the start. These are all things that I learned over time. So what I want to say to you here is, up to 80% of autistic people struggle here. And the thing is, if you can't deliver in this area, your class is doing adulting badly. Your class is being like lazy, immature, you know, not responsible, irresponsible, because these are expected things, and people don't realise how critical they are. And they don't teach this in school, do they? They don't teach this in college. When you get to work, like I learned a lot of my stuff on the job. When I started working in big corporates, and they're teaching you about time management and using diaries and all that kind of thing. And I just soaked it all up like a sponge, because I was desperate to fit in and do well. But really, we should be teaching young people and young adults this from a very young age, particularly take it right back to the base level, being able to look after yourself, being able to know that you should get up in the morning and brush your teeth, wash your face, make sure your clothes are clean, take your medication on time, make a healthy eating choice, as opposed to just, you know, eating cold takeaway from the fridge. It's like, it's so critical to someone's independence. And it doesn't matter if that autistic person has learning disabilities, that individual still has the right to work on their autonomy and self-determination. And they'll never be able, you know, independence skills is already intrinsically challenged in people with learning disabilities. But unless we teach them some of these core skills of adulting, how are they ever going to show a degree of independence? And then we have this intolerance of uncertainty. And this is one that you can help us with really, really effectively, because we get a bad reputation for being controlling, autistic people, because we like things done our way. We ask loads of questions which can come across as really annoying, and we're very prescriptive in how we like to do things. I remember before my husband knew I was autistic, and especially when we had our middle son, that was our first living son, he used to get really upset with me and say, it's your way or the highway, because I had very specific ways of doing the baby's nappy, the bath, the bedtime routine, that in my head, if that wasn't followed, it was catastrophic, because that was absolutely the right way. And he used to make me feel like I was like this master criminal, manipulative, like just trying to force him to do it my way. But it wasn't that at all. I was in such a state of constant fear that something would happen to the baby. Those rituals and routines were my way of mitigating the anxiety, of keeping all of us safe. So what you can do is use your effective communication skills to reduce that uncertainty, involve us in change, teach us relaxation exercises so that ambiguity doesn't overwhelm us, because we don't live in a world of definites, do we? So you can't always provide the answer, you can't always remove the ambiguous, but you can unpick it and you can put measures in place so that it's more palatable and doesn't feel so scary. In fact, I'll just tell you this quickly, conscious of time, but I was training some care homes the other day for adults and learning disabilities, and one of the ladies shared that they had someone in the home who, every time the fire alarm test was done, she was so terrified of it and she hated it so much, and she had to go outside the building, outside the house. She could not be there, and this went on for years. And then one day someone thought to actually involve her in the process, and they took her up to the office and they showed her the fire panel and they showed her the log and why it had to be done and what it meant. And they got her to press the button. And she pressed the button and the alarm went off, but she didn't panic. She didn't freak out, because suddenly this wasn't just the horrible thing that happened that she really, really hated. This was something that, oh, right, okay, so this is why it's done, and this is where it all happens, and I can make that noise. I can be the person to make that noise happen. That's what I mean about giving back the control and the certainty. So how can you help? So first of all, if we're trying to build someone's connections with emotions and what people are feeling, sit down and watch a film together, watch their favourite TV programme and say to them, what do you think that person's feeling? Why do you think they're acting like that? And just have a chat about it. Very natural, very organic. You know, this needs to be done over weeks and months, but starting to get them to notice what a person looks like when they're angry. Or how do you know when someone's bored? How do you know when someone's sad? Keep a mood diary. So try and help them, depending on their level of cognitive ability. It might be them keeping the diary, it might be you doing it with them or for them, but trying to create that link between what they're actually feeling and their body's sensations. So I know now that when I start to feel very overwhelmed and panicked and a meltdown is coming, I break out in a full body sweat and I get hot, like really, really, really hot. I feel like my blood is cooking on the inside of my body. And that in itself makes me feel panicky. But I now know that if I start to feel those bodily sensations, I need to remove myself from the situation because it's too much. I need to ask for help. I need to, you know, if someone, I don't know, someone starts shouting at me in a shop because they think I pushed in the queue, you know, I know that I need to remove myself from those situations because I find them very threatening. And I now listen to my body sensations, because often the body sensations start to happen before the actual emotions and feelings that then trigger the meltdown. Physical exercise is so important. For someone that both has poor alexithymia and or poor interoception, you need to help them explore that mind-body connection. People don't know what their bodies are capable of unless they do exercise. They don't know how they can change the shape and their, you know, and change their strength and their flexibility. It's quite fascinating for people that have never properly exercised. It's quite fascinating for them to see how they can influence that, and that helps support that mind-body connection, that awareness, particularly for people that have motor difficulties. Physical exercise is really, really important because they're always going to have those motor difficulties, but you can improve their physical control and their strength and their flexibility and their coordination. You absolutely can with exercise and physiotherapy. So that's really, really important. Breathing exercises, as I mentioned, are great for emotional regulation. I just do like my antenatal breathing, in for 4 and out for 8. That is my go-to. And I taught my toddler, when Henry, my 7-year-old, was a toddler, he used to have these cracking meltdowns, what he still does. But now, if I say to him, do you need to do your breathing? Sometimes that can just be enough to make him stop and think, and then we'll sit together and do that breathing, and it's actually really good for me because I find his meltdowns really triggering. So by doing the breathing together, we're both calming down so that I can deal more rationally with his current issues. Getting out in nature is also really important. 2 of my absolute passions, my special interests, are wild swimming and rock pooling and like net fishing in lakes and rivers. I really like catching like newts and little tiddlers and just to look at. I know it's weird, but that is like my happiest space. And I've realized that being in nature is such a great way to develop mindfulness, because you forget about your devices and the people that you live with that annoy you, and you know, it's just a way of really connecting with something organic and natural. And in particular, I'm also a really keen photographer. All the pictures you see on these slides are mine, and I find combining going on those walks and then photographing what I see, it just takes me to another place, and I'd really recommend people try it. And then become the teacher. Teach them how to use calendars, how to set reminders on their phones, how to make to-do lists so they don't forget. You know, all of that kind of stuff that helps you manage your day. Agreeing which, you know, having a day in the month when they do their, I know a lot of people hate fingernails and toenails, or if they have to have their hair cut every 6 weeks, let's put that in the calendar so we can build up towards it, particularly if it's something they don't like. And then provide the certainty in your words, in your actions, in the routines that you follow, and respect for them. Give that certainty in an uncertain world. I did also want to mention to you about invalidation trauma, because this is something that is in effect emotional abuse. Sometimes it's unintentional, completely unintentional, but occurs anyway. And sometimes it's very intentional and done by family or friends or caregivers, as I've experienced. And it has lifelong negative effects. So some of the things that I've heard growing up and heard said about me, she's just doing it for attention. You're too sensitive. Autism is not an excuse for bad behaviour. You need to change your ways. She's a control freak. Here she goes upsetting everyone again. Why'd you have to be so difficult? And you're embarrassing yourself. Stop it. When I got my autism diagnosis, and I thought my family was suddenly going to have this empathy, and they start making adjustments and realising what, you know, why I don't always want to be the host just because I've got a bigger house, and I'm not, I live in a bungalow. It's a 3-bedroom bungalow, but because I had a bigger house than any of my siblings, every time they wanted to have a family gathering, they want to have it here. And I'd find that so hard, the invasion on my safe space, the mess, you know, especially because I gave up alcohol 2.5 years ago. Being around drunk people is just, I find it quite vile now, which is ironic because for many years I was that annoying drunk person trying to cope in a social situation. But I thought that I would be able to explain why the answer was no without them hating me, thinking I was really mean. But no, it didn't. What happens is when we're constantly invalidated, we start to believe that our natural autistic responses are wrong. And you'll find, I bet if you think about it, a lot of the autistic people you know are always apologising. They're always saying sorry, because we get so used to being told that we're wrong. And the thing is, when we try and self-advocate and we say, I know you think this is me being difficult, but, or can I please open a window? Do you mind if I open a window? I know you're all cold, but I'm boiling hot. I'll sit by the window. And then they just, you know, they criticise you, they gaslight you, or they ignore you when you're frozen out. And frankly, it's terrifying. And the way it felt to me, when it got to the point that I had to say no more, it felt like I was being gagged and bound. It felt like I had no voice. And that was actually when I started writing my blog, because I needed to find a way to get these feelings out. And they refused to let me have a voice. I asked my mum, I asked her many times over the years to talk to me about what had happened, and she refused. And then in the run up to the final sort of breakdown, I begged her and I said, you need to be able to appreciate how you make me feel and what you've done to me and how it's affecting my life. And the thing is, she would say everything wasn't on purpose. Trust me, a lot of that stuff was very manipulative and very deliberate. But there was also stuff that she, at my early childhood, she was naive and young and in a bad situation herself. And she actually agreed with me. She said she would speak to me. And I said, message the family group. And I said, Mum, thank you so much. I'm so happy. This means the world to me. And I know it's going to bring us closer together. And I woke up the next morning. Oh, and one of my brothers replied and said, Mum, you don't have anything to apologise for. And then the next morning I woke up and my mum had left a message in the group chat saying, I don't have anything to apologise for. I've always done my best. I will not be talking to you. And that was when I knew that I needed to remove the gag. Like, they can't keep doing this to me. And perhaps you've done it without meaning to autistic people. You know, I do autism training now, and some of the organisations that I go into, I can tell that it's like they really want a real autistic person to work with them, but they don't really want to have to deal with the fact that, oh, she's actually autistic and she's asking me 5,000 questions. And what does she mean she wants a fan in the training room? You know, it's like, I kind of feel like they don't want my reality. And that's not them being negative. It's just, you know, as human beings, how we are. We want things to go how we expect them to go. And when this autistic person comes in and says, I need this, this, and this, then it's a bit like, oh, that's a bit of a nuisance. So how did I achieve emotional well-being? So since my autism and bipolar diagnosis, I don't know if I mentioned, I don't know if I've just thrown that in. 6 months after my autism diagnosis, I was diagnosed with bipolar 2. It's the manic depressive version of bipolar. I have a lot of lows and I don't have mania. I'm not like risk taking, and I'm actually quite boring. I have hypermania. So in hypermania, I don't sleep for days on end. I'm super productive and achieve absolutely loads, but I'm also very irritable, quite wired. It's quite fortunate then the depression's almost from my husband, I think, easier to deal with than the hypermania. But those two pieces of information, Lizzy, you're autistic, Lizzy, you have bipolar 2. It was like someone gave me the rule book to my brain, or the instruction manual, that said, this is why you are. You was asking why all those years. This is the why. And that for me was like so empowering. And it meant that I could know myself and I could advocate for my needs in a way that I'd never been able to before, because I just felt like I was a bad version of a human being, that I was failing to be who everyone else wanted me to be. And suddenly it was like, oh, I'm not like them. Okay. So even if other people didn't listen, it's still very empowering to advocate. I now really indulge my special interests because I know that those are the things that make me feel whole. An autistic person's special interest is intrinsically linked to their self-esteem. It's that thing that like makes their heart beat faster or get out of bed in the morning. It's so important. And it's a really good way you can connect with them, and enabling them, giving them the tools and the resources and the time to indulge their special interests is a fab way to build emotional well-being. You do also have to work on people with growth mindset. So I learned about growth mindset years and years ago when I was a trainer for the Body Shop International. And I realized as an autistic person, actually, I don't have very good growth mindset. I put barriers up around myself. I think that I can't do things because I don't want to fail, I guess. So, for example, my children are really accomplished cyclists, and I have cycled in the past, but I think because I have some motor coordination issues, I fall off a lot and hurt myself. I'm very fearful. And then I was like, well, why don't I get a tricycle? And everyone laughed at me and said, that's really embarrassing. And everyone will think you're an old granny. And I thought, do you know what? I don't really care. If it means that I can cycle with my boys and we can have adventures. So I've got a tricycle. She's called Guinevere. And she's got this massive, like, thing at the back where I can put all of the wetsuits when we go wild swimming, the picnic, the coats, the frisbee. You know, she's one of the best things that I've done. I passed my driving test just before I had my second son. But I then didn't drive for 8 years because I was so scared of, like, when they were babies, it was about them choking in the back seat. Then as I got older, it was about them being in a crash while I was driving. And it got to the point when my oldest son moved to a school that was 3 miles away, that I had to challenge my growth mindset and say, do you know what? You can drive. You're going to have to bloody drive, woman. And so I took some more lessons with an instructor that understood about autism. And my husband bought me my first car, my Vida. I'm just trying to think, she was 12 then, so she's 15 now. But she's perfectly functional. She's just a lot more dented and scratched than she was when I got her. But again, it's about that growth mindset. Instead of saying, no, I can't drive because I could be in a crash and it will kill the boys, I had to really work with myself. And I've surprised myself in both instances with how much I've enjoyed challenging myself to do those things. So you need to help the autistic people that you work with learn about, and you don't have to use the language of growth mindset if you think it'll be out of their sort of, not something they can relate to. It's about believing in yourself. It's about trying. It's about not being scared of failure. There's also a lot of catharsis that can be achieved through art. So I don't just mean painting, I mean music or sports, or for me it's my blogging and my photography is a great way of expressing myself when I couldn't be heard any other way. I'm very protective of my alone time. I understand now that I'm not a weirdo for wanting time on my own. That is actually essential to my well-being, particularly after a social event. Like, autistic people can be introverts and extroverts just like anybody else, but even an extrovert autistic person, after a social engagement, they'll be like, oh, and they'll just need peace, calm, quiet. The worst thing you can do for them, maybe they live in a care home and you've got an activities coordinator, and every day it's like there's all this really cool stuff, and the autistic person's thinking, oh my god, I just want to stay in my room. You know, you need to allow that alone time, that recharging, because our social energy battery runs out really quickly. That doesn't mean some autistic people like me don't really enjoy social engagements, but some autistic people, like my oldest son, love it, but he still gets absolutely worn out afterwards and he needs time to recover. Say no if you don't want to. I learned once I had my diagnosis, no, I don't want to go to people's leaving drinks anymore because I hate saying goodbyes. I find them excruciating, like almost like a phobia about it. No, I don't want to go in busy pubs or restaurants where people are all close around me and there's loads of smells. Like, it makes me really angry. So I know to say no now. But if the individual wants to say yes, help them set the boundaries. So when I was growing up and everybody else like Wham and Bros, I was in love with Billy Joel. I've loved him my whole life. I know all of his songs. And a couple of years ago, my husband surprised me with tickets for my birthday. And I have to admit, I was a bit terrified. Like, on one hand, I was really excited. On another hand, I was dreading it because of my experience of concerts when I was younger, and the crush and the heat and the queuing, and like, it's almost like I didn't want to go, but I did want to go. But my husband was so thoughtful in how he understood my boundaries. So he booked us a hotel that we could easily travel to Wembley on the overground, because he knows I'm really scared of the tubes. And then he booked tickets that was seated near the front, but on an aisle. So I had my own designated space, but if I wanted to get up and stand up, I could do it in the little corridor bit. Like, he did all of these little things. That he took snacks in my bag because I get really low energy. And it's not even, it feels like a low physical energy, but it's the overwhelm, the noise and the sounds and the smells. It makes me go, almost feel like I'm going to faint. So he packed me loads of little nibbles because that sort of gives me a boost. So you can help autistic people say yes to the things they really want to do, but help them protect themselves by respecting their boundaries. Work on executive functioning skills because they're essential. Talk about your communication needs. So as an autistic person, I really hate using the phone. I know I have to do it sometimes. I find phone calls a bit scary because I don't know what the person's going to say and I haven't had a chance to prepare. And my preparedness gives me calm, keeps me centered. So I will proactively say to people now, when they say, can I have your phone number? I'll give you a call, and I'll be like, can you give me an email actually? And I'm very honest and say, I really don't want to talk on the phone. I've had to establish my own healthy sleep routine because I'm someone that would stay up into the early hours of the morning, pursuing my special interests, working on my photography or my blog, in peace and quiet, because it's the only peace and quiet you get when you live with two noisy autistic children. But I've had to recognize that it was really not good for my mental health and well-being. And so now I've forced myself into a pattern of, you know, a reasonable bedtime and a reasonable getting up time. And I'm reaping the benefits of that. I've actually, bizarrely, my whole life, I've just been so bad at getting out of bed, and I've become a morning person just by having a sleep routine. My husband thinks it's hilarious. It's like one thing that he's been able to control. I do also practice mindfulness to improve my sleep quality. So I've got an app that helps me. It does like guided meditations to get you off to sleep, or sleep stories, or even just sleep nature sounds. At the moment I've been listening to beach cabin campfire or something. It's like waves and a crackly campfire. It works for me, but whatever works for the individual. And ending destructive habits. So the reason I gave up alcohol was because I recognized that I was much more argumentative after I'd been drinking. It was very destructive for my sleep patterns. And I wasn't a nice version of myself, like, because I'm naturally quite reserved and shy. But then I'd have a drink and I'd be like, yay, talk to anyone. And you know, the autistic tendency to overshare, could be very embarrassing, because I'd be telling complete strangers my life story. And then I'd wake up going like, oh, I can't believe I was speaking to those people. Like, I'm not a friendly person. I hate that false, like, you know, the false intimacy that comes with drinking and making you feel close to people that you're not close to. I really struggle with that. So knocking that on the head is one of the best things we've ever done. And then dressing for comfort, no itchy labels, no, you know, who cares what's fashionable or what's expected. If someone really can't go to an interview in a suit because they feel, you know, the stiff and itchy seams, and then need to advocate for them up front that actually they prefer to come in their own clothes. That should be accepted. Communicate your sensory needs. So I've learned now to say to people that I really struggle with heat, or that I really struggle with loud noise. Loud noise makes me really angry, especially my children. I keep threatening them that I'm going to get ear defenders like Henry has. I'm sure I'll look really embarrassing, but sometimes it's just the only way I can cope. I can't bear loud noise. I've also had to explore my relationship with food, because I'm an overeater, and I've realised that a lot of my excessive eating I'm doing it for sensory reasons. I'm doing it because the crunch, the chew, the texture, the act of swallowing the food, it's sensory input that I'm seeking. It's not even about being hungry or wanting that particular food. And because of that, I'm having to start to think about how else can I get that sensory input so that I'm not just relying on food, because obviously it has a negative impact on my weight. And then I did have to break contact with the people that continue to invalidate me, which I don't know if it's ever something I'll be able to reconcile with, because you feel completely cut adrift, and like it's your fault because that's what they tell you. But I know logically that it's the right decision for my mental health and well-being. Just quickly before questions, the 3 main things you can do to help: be the advocate when needed, where you have non-speaking autistic individuals, learning disabled autistic individuals, or those with motor difficulties where their communication is inhibited, or simply maybe they are verbal, but maybe they're really socially isolated. Be that advocate, understand their needs and present their needs to protect them in any situation. Also, never give up with enabling self-advocacy. I keep meeting people on courses that I deliver where there's autistic adults, and because they've never been empowered in their education to explore augmentative and alternative communication methods, you know, nobody's ever used picture cards with them. On a course the other day, I said someone was talking about an individual who only grunts and makes gestures, but clearly has a very high level of comprehension and knows what they want. And I said, have you ever used picture cards? And she said, oh no, I don't think you'd go with that. And I said, but I want you to do me a favour and just go back and try, because you can start with the basics, like showing them pictures for the meal options, or so he could tell you when he needs a drink or the toilet. But then you can start to move it onto faces, so it can show you, I'm upset, I'm scared, I'm worried, I'm feeling really happy, and I want to go outside. You know, it's like there are so many alternative methods for communication now. And if you've because of questions, I'm not going to get time to go through this one slide that I wanted to go through with you, but look up Ido Kedar. He's a young American man, autistic, significant motor difficulties. In his early life, because of his motor difficulties and his inability to engage with the therapies that were given to him, he was thought to have very low cognitive ability. And then when he was 7, his mum was working on birthday invites with him, and she had his hand under her hand and she was helping him type, and she stopped for a minute and he carried on typing, and she was like, what? And everybody thought she was mad, like, no, this child doesn't have cognitive ability. This child is now like a college graduate. he's a published author, a public speaker via alternative communication methods. He doesn't have a voice per se, but he can have his voice heard through alternative communication. And this is an individual that he describes how he felt completely trapped inside his own body, and how he was being taught really babyish things like 1+1 and nursery rhymes. And he was saying, please, at least try and teach age-appropriate subjects, because you don't know what's in there. And he found his way out. And that's how I want you to look at, with fresh eyes, sort of renewed eyes, look at the autistic people that you support. Just like with an employee, you'd do an annual appraisal, wouldn't you? What their strengths and development needs this year, and how are they doing? You should be doing that with the autistic person, because we don't stay in a static place. We evolve, we change, and maybe some of them are waiting to be let out. And the other thing is that person that provides the validation, listen without judgment, make adjustments that they reckon that they need, and recognise what's our normal. It may not be your normal, and yet it may be really annoying. I find a lot of what my sons do is really annoying, but it's their normal. And I have to act as almost like a mediator sometimes, because my husband's neurotypical, and he will see my oldest son's behaviour as being controlling or over the top, because his younger brother has touched something of his that he didn't want them to touch, and he's really, really upset and crying. And my husband thinks, oh, he's just being completely over the top. But no, that's don't invalidate him. That's how my oldest son feels. He's really protective over his possessions, and we need to respect his boundaries. I don't know if you're going to be sent a copy of these slides, but there's some lovely explanations from Ido Kedar there of therapies and support that he was receiving and what he really needed. She can understand what things helped him. Questions? I know we haven't got a lot of time, but hit me with it.
Wow, Lizzy, I think just so many comments coming in, people thanking you for doing such an amazing job. So many. I'm gonna take a copy of them and I'll share them with you.
Oh, so amazing! Thank you.
Because they're lovely. Just a very quick comment from me, Lizzy. We know each other because we've done a bit of work together, and I'm so sorry because I've not learned some of the things you asked for from us. Getting the wrong link to you today was the worst possible thing that we could have done, and I'm so sorry. And you're amazing. But and you've made me almost commit to never doing any trying to train anyone in autism again, because you are just head and shoulders just spectacularly better than anything I've ever done ever. And anyway, not about me, we're really short on time, but there's a couple I will, if you're happy, I'll take a copy of all of these and I'll get them to you. And if perhaps if you get a chance to respond to people, if you're happy.
No, I definitely will. If there's email addresses, or I can send the answers back to you, whatever you prefer, but I definitely will respond, because I think it's really
brilliant.
Important.
Well, just a quick one for you guys who are watching. I'm going to ask a couple of questions for Lizzy now, just in the last couple of minutes. But if you just drop your email addresses down, I'll filter it for Lizzy, so I'll get the email address to the question and that kind of stuff. But whoever's asked the question, please just drop your email address in, and we'll look to do that. But a very quick one, Lizzy, possibly by Harmesh, and forgive me if I'm not pronouncing it right. For an adult, how to get an autism diagnosis, please?
So the starting place is always going to be your GP. What you'll find is that each local authority has an assessment and treatment service. And actually, as an autistic adult, it's much easier to get a diagnosis. It might not feel like it, but it is easier than a child. With a child, because they can't advocate for themselves, you have all of these different stakeholders, speech and language, occupational therapists, teachers, health visitors, having to provide evidence and observations. Whereas as an adult, the emphasis is on you to advocate for yourself. So it's all about preparedness. And before I went to the GP, because autism became my special interest when my son got diagnosed, and I learned so much so quickly. So I looked at all of the different traits, and then I looked at where I felt, how I felt that matched me. So that I literally went into the GP with like a 12-page printed essay on my presentation. I also had a psychiatrist, I still have a psychiatrist, and he got me to take statements from my mum about what I was like as a child, and from my husband about what I was like in relationships. And I even went to I used to work for American Express for several years, and I went to my leaders at American Express and said, look, I'm being assessed for autism. Is there anything that you saw in my behaviours? And they came back with like tons of stuff, which was so embarrassing, because they obviously saw a lot of stuff, and it was never dealt with, because I was a really good employee and they thought really highly of me, but they clearly found me quite difficult to manage. So I would say that preparedness and evidence finding, going to the GP, having the confidence to say I want to be referred to the assessment and treatment service from my local authority, and then being prepared to wait, because at the time that I was assessed, the wait was only 6 months, but the lady then that was doing it for our local area, I'm in Sussex, she left to go to another county, and then the waiting list ended up being 2 years because there was such a backlog by the time they hired someone else. A lot of people do go private. If you've got the money and you can find someone that you trust based on other people's feedback, you know, engaging with the autistic community online, you know, there's lots of social media groups to find recommendations for people have used, then that might, for people that want a faster answer and can afford it, might be an option.
And I'm afraid, do you know what, Lizzie? I'd have to cancel the next talk, I think, to get through all the questions that people have asked.
Well, I promise that I will write replies to all of them. You're
an absolute star. Lizzie, just fantastic. Again, you've not done anything for my nerves going on to present now, because that was just absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone who's been listening and contributing. There is so many questions and so many comments, and I can't remember seeing such a positive stream of feedback, Lizzie, during one of these presentations.
Cool. Thank you. That means a lot to me. Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Lizzie, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have a lovely day, and
take care, Paddy. Good luck with the rest of the day.
Thanks, Lizzie. Thanks so much.